14. The lust for sovereignty. A problem in many discussions of sovereignty is men's failure to recognize that sovereignty is much more than either a philosophical or a theological concept. Thus, George Gervich, in The Dictionary of Sociology, saw three different types of sovereignty as the term applies to a power, a group, or a dual order. These three are: first, dual sovereignty, the primacy of one dual order over other dual orders; second, political sovereignty, the monopoly of power by a state within its realm; and third, the sovereignty of the people, the inalienable prerogative of the people for self-rule. Alfred E. Garvey, however, defined sovereignty in religious terms exclusively with reference to various doctrines of God and without reference to other forms of the doctrine. Sovereignty is more than an idea. It is the exercise of ultimate power. Criminal leaders have claimed it for their territories, and corrupt political figures have done the same. Dissenters are assured of death at times for refusing to acknowledge such claims. Such men have not been alone in their assertions. The sword at one's throat, or a gun at one's head, is an assertion of power, and very often of sovereignty as well. Long before Rome fell, the barbarians were moving into the empire. In the year that Augustine died, Hippo fell. Rome had fallen much earlier. The German barbarians overran most of the empire. In the 7th and 8th centuries, the Saracens in the Mediterranean world conquered many areas. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Scandinavians, or Norsemen, or Vikings, seized some areas and raided others. The Magyars took other areas in northern and central Europe. The Arabs took many areas, and then the Turks took over much of the Near East, Georgia, Armenia, and Byzantium, and later were at the gates of Vienna. For more than 1,000 years, invasions marked Christendom and gave to the various areas new pagans, new rulers claiming sovereignty, power, and more. The Christian mission was thus a complicated one. In northern Europe, for example, Charlemagne had to contend with tribes practicing human sacrifice. Missionaries barely began the Christianization of many areas of Europe before fresh pagan influxes and rules disrupted their work and necessitated fresh beginnings. Moreover, even as these invasions were ending, paganized political doctrines arose to insist on the freedom of the state from Christian claims and controls. The Church was repeatedly silenced and controlled. In view of all this, it is ironic that men indict the Church for having failed after 20 centuries to Christianize Europe. The miracle is the survival of the Church from Georgia and Armenia, Egypt, and other regions to Sweden and Norway. Every attempt was made to destroy the Church. At the same time, historians have had much to say about the mistreatment by one church of another. Thus, we are told of the damage done by the Puritans to the Anglican churches. This was slight compared to the assaults of Henry VIII on the Church, or the wars waged by Catholic monarchs on the continent against their churches and monasteries. The Benedictine monasteries in 1789 numbered about 1,500 in all of Europe. In 1814, there were about 30, and these had fewer men and had been despoiled of their assets. Quote-unquote Catholic monarchs had been as active in the destruction as French revolutionists, and the same was true in the days of Henry VIII. This is not to deny that religious conflict led to evil acts by one church against another. The major destruction has come from unbelievers, sometimes deliberately, sometimes callously and casually. A.L. Maycock is typical of many writers in seeing the minor damage by Puritans of the little Gildings Church But while noting the condition of the church when Nicholas Ferrar became pastor, he does not recognise that the condition of little Giddings was commonplace in England. The nave and chancel had been stuffed with hay to the roof. Some of the buildings, perhaps the sacristy on the south side, had been used as a pigsty. All the windows had been knocked out, and filth and rubbish were everywhere. In the past 2 centuries, in Ireland, Russia, Spain and elsewhere, radical and revolutionary groups have regularly destroyed churches, as did the British troops in America during the War of Independence. Attacks on churches are expressions of contempt for the sovereignty of God. For this reason, churches the world over have been the targets of hatred, vandalism, and attack, because whereas non-biblical religions do not threaten the sovereignty of man, Christianity does. St. Augustine was cynical about the causes of wars and about the use of words like glory and victory by politicians. For him, men were governed by the lust of sovereignty. Augustine wrote, "The vice of restless ambition was the sole motive to that social and patricidal war, a vice which Sallust brands in passing, for when he has spoken with brief but hearty commendation of those primitive times in which life was spent without covetousness, and everyone was sufficiently satisfied with what he had, he goes on, but after Cyrus in Asia, and the Lacedaemonians and Athenians in Greece began to subdue cities and nations, and to account the lust of sovereignty a sufficient ground for war, and to reckon that the greatest glory consisted in the greatest empire, and so on, as I need not now quote. This lust of sovereignty disturbs and consumes the human face with frightful ills. By this lust Rome was overcome when she triumphed over Alba, and, praising her own crime, called it glory. For, as our scriptures say, the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire, and blesseth the covetous, whom the Lord abhorreth. This lust for sovereignty is the outcome of man's original sin. Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. Man's desire to be his own God and to know or determine good and evil, law and morality for himself. Unscrupulous politicians lead the people to believe that they will gain the upper hand through their leaders to realize their lust for sovereignty through the state. Historically, the lust for sovereignty has led to wars and conflict. The triune God needs to prove nothing. He is the living God. He can wait with patience for men to bring his judgments on themselves by their contempt for and violation of the laws of being. The false gods, men who lust for sovereignty, must prove to themselves and to others that they are the new gods of creation by exerting raw power over others. For the days of Lamech to the present, Genesis chapter 4 verses 19 to 24, the boast is in essence the same. The man who wounds me, him I slay. I slay a blow for a blow. Genesis chapter 4, verse 23, Moffat's translation. This demonstration must be endlessly repeated to maintain the claim. Hence, anti-Christian societies will see, both in social policy and personal action, an insistence on a radical conflict of interests and continual warfare of social classes. Frederick William I of Prussia wrote, a year after his succession, "One must serve the king with life, and after, with goods and chattels, with honour and conscience, and surrender everything except salvation. The latter is reserved for God, but everything else is mine." Given this perspective on all sides, it is not surprising that churches become viewed increasingly as a norm of the secular state. Since then, the state's claim to sovereignty has been more emphatic, and, at the same time, the people are convinced that their own lust for sovereignty is a justifiable one. As in the days of Judges, now we also are seeing the implications of the rejection of the kingship and sovereignty of Jesus Christ. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Judges chapter 21, verse 25.